Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome, another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. We had intended, when we were charting this out for this particular podcast, to be about Canada-U.S. relations, and it is going to be. But, of course, from the time that we decided to do something like this to now when we're recording this, there's been an update. Prime Minister Carney told us with a media conference that he held in Ottawa on Friday that indeed the meeting between Donald Trump and Mark Carney will take place this coming Tuesday in Washington at the White House. And that's good news, and we should be happy about that, but look forward to this with a great deal of trepidation, because there's a lot at stake here and a lot of elements at play here between the two world leaders here, the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States. And a lot of this, of course, is predicated about some of the things that we heard during the recent Canadian election campaign from Mark Carney, now Prime Minister Carney, and from Donald Trump and the rhetoric. And I know that over and over again, Prime Minister Carney's talked about the fact that the traditional relationship between Canada and the United States is over. And there's a certain finality to that. And some people were saying, well, that's really fear-mongering. It's not. It's reality. It is over. And it's because of the guy who's in the White House right now. But Carney has always tried to indicate that, and I think rightly so, that doesn't mean our relationship with the United States is over. We still have to trade with them. They still are our neighbor to the south, and we've got to have some sort of a relationship with them, even an economic relationship. And I would imagine one of the short-term goals and probably one of the long-term goals of this meeting is going to be defining exactly what that relationship's going to be. Because clearly Donald Trump doesn't like the way things used to be. And there's an argument to be made that we're looking for a better deal, not just as far as tariffs and other things are concerned, but maybe something a little more solid that we can move forward on with some sense of stability. And as we've talked about many, many times, of course, on the podcast, when you look at economics and you look at things like inflation, et cetera, stability is what people are looking for. That's what economists are looking for. And right now we don't have it, for a variety of reasons, but we don't, and we need to establish that. And a solid deal that's respected and adhered to by both sides will go a long way towards doing that. So what are we looking for here? What are the goals and what are the expectations of this meeting on Tuesday? Well, as Prime Minister Carney mentioned on his Friday media conference up in Ottawa, he says there's not going to be any white smoke, obviously a reference to the oncoming conclave here, another selection of a new pope. Neither the Prime Minister nor the President are going to come out of this meeting and say, it's all solved. Hey, happy days. Everything's solved. We got our differences set aside and things are going to be great. That's not going to happen. So let's put that out there right now. But what they can do is have a conversation about establishing some of that foundation. What are we looking for? What is the U.S. looking for? And that's not really a mystery, because I think both sides have been pretty open about at least stating what we'd like to see here. Number one, of course, as far as the Canadians are concerned, is tariffs. The crippling tariffs that Trump has imposed, I think wrongly, and I think most people in the world would agree wrongly. And there's a great deal of concern right now about the short-term and long-term impacts of those tariffs. And you got to know that that's going to be, if not the number one item on the agenda, it's right near the top. And again, what happens here? There's an argument to be made that Trump doesn't quite know what he's doing, but he has the power to institute these tariffs, and he's got support. In the previous Trump administration, when he was doing some wildly crazy things, there were people in the Trump administration, in the White House and in other departments, that tried to be the voice of reason, that said, Mr. President, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he didn't. But that was then, this is now. The reality that we're facing now is that Trump has surrounded himself now with sycophants, both within his administration, within his cabinet, and within the people that work in the White House and in the number of departments, from defense and trade, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's going to say, Mr. President, you got it wrong. They're simply going to nod their head and say, yep, sir, yes, sir, whatever you want. And that's going to be difficult, because we need to have some dissenting voices. We need to have some voices of reason here. And I'm not so sure that that's going to be happening in Washington. But you know what? We know that. I'm sure that the Prime Minister and his team are going to go into these discussions and these meetings with that in mind, and understand that that's just one of the things that we're going to have to navigate around, or at least accept that it is there and try to work some sort of an agreement with that. So that's going to be a key element to this. How do we find trust? That's really what we talked about. And when the Prime Minister says that, the long-term and traditional relationship between Canada and the U.S. is over, that the key element there is trust is gone. There is a lack of trust right now. And I can understand why. I mean, we've seen hard evidence of that time and time again, haven't we? With a number of things that are happening. For instance, even the fact that the free trade deal is being ripped apart right now. We call it CUSMA on this side of the border, but that was negotiated by the Trump administration some years ago. And Robert Lighthizer was his lead negotiator, and he, matter of fact, was just in Ottawa at a conservative conference, a confab. But Trump praised the deal. He signed on to this deal. When he's ranting and raving about this is the worst deal ever for the United States, who really, signed this up? You did, Mr. President. You yourself did. And at the press conference when you signed it, you said it was the greatest deal in the history of free trade and the free trade and relationships between Canada and the U.S. Obviously, he's changed his mind. Doesn't matter if it's a rational decision or not. That's the way things are. So, if Trump is simply going to look at things, whether it's a free trade deal with Canada, whether it's a ruling from the Supreme Court or whatever, if he's simply going to ignore that, ignore the rules and regulations, and ignore the commitments that he's made, it's awfully hard to trust the guy and to say, okay, we've got ourselves a deal. Well, that means we got ourselves a deal today, but what about tomorrow? It's so whimsical sometimes with the change of policy. That's going to be very, very difficult to ascertain. But we need to set some ground rules, and we need to set some parameters for this. Now, one of the other elements that has to be discussed, and I'm sure is being discussed right now, is who's going to be involved in this. As we know, these are very, very serious negotiations that will be upcoming, and rarely, if ever, do the leaders of these countries actually roll their sleeves up and get involved in the negotiations. Trump is not going to be at the negotiating table. Carney is not going to be at the negotiating table. There's a team in place. And who's going to be on this Team Canada that the Prime Minister talks about? Well, he has not, as we do this podcast, announced his cabinet. We're told that's going to happen in a few days. But that doesn't mean he can't bring some people along as advisors that are going to be at the table, at least for this initial discussion and going forward. And there are some very qualified people that I'm sure are going to be involved in this. Francois-Philippe Champagne, the former innovation minister and former finance minister, briefly, I'm most certain will be there. Dominic LeBlanc, who's a trusted and longtime cabinet member who did some finance work as well, may well be there. Chrystia Freeland, I don't think is going to be there. Matter of fact, I can pretty much guarantee you she's not going to be at the table. Trump doesn't like her, and I'm not so sure that she would be somebody who could actually garner that trust and respect at the table right now. She did an incredible job under very trying circumstances negotiating that first deal, the revamped CUSMA deal some years ago. But Trump doesn't like her. His administration doesn't like her. I think it would be detrimental to have her there. And by the way, that's not to suggest that her political career is over. She did get reelected, and I'm guessing that when Carney does announce his cabinet in a few days, she's probably going to have a role. I don't know if it's going to be on the front benches in a key post, but she's going to be there in some way, shape, or form. So anyway, count on people like Champagne, Melanie Joly, of course, Dominic LeBlanc, Bill Blair, possibly, because defense is going to have to be involved in that too. So there will be a team, if not all at the White House this time, but most certainly people that are going to be involved in the Team Canada approach to this. And that's going to be important. People that can be trusted, people that the Americans know by reputation. And like I say, you don't have to love the people across the table, but you have to respect them. And we want to make sure that that's going to be happening too. So the most important part of this, I guess, is well, what are we going to talk about? Tariffs, absolutely. Tariffs. And we want the tariffs eliminated. I don't know that that's going to happen. And again, it's very hard to predict exactly how Trump is going to respond to some of these things. But that's got to be one of the key elements. But there are so many more things that are involved in this. There's been talk, as we've talked about on the podcast, that it's time to renegotiate that CUSMA deal. Well, technically, it's not. It was supposed to be done next year in 2026. I would guess that that's going to be moved up because of the angst and the acrimony that's going on between the two countries right now. But do you put everything on the table? Is that only going to slow the process down? If we go up there and said, okay, we want the tariffs removed, the first thing the Americans are going to ask is, okay, what are you going to give us? It's supposed to be a negotiation. Sometimes it's more one way than the other, but the negotiation. And I think we have a pretty good idea on some of the things that the Americans are looking for, that they'd like to see back on the table. Some of these came up, of course, during the recent campaign. I know the Americans are really ticked off about the supply management organization and deal between the Canadian government and dairy farmers in general, of course, on this side of the border. They say it's unfair. I would suggest quite the contrary. As a matter of fact, it's somewhat hypocritical because what the Americans don't seem to want to understand here, or certainly even acknowledge, is that the American government subsidizes American farmers. Dairy farmers. They most certainly do, not under the guise of supply management, but they do get subsidies. So, I mean, this is, it's okay for us to do, but not for you to do. It's problematic that that's going to be their attitude on this. And the other, I guess, element to this whole thing is we in the public oftentimes try to make our judgments what's going on and what could be going on based on some of the rhetoric that comes from the leaders. Trump's suggesting, for instance, supply management is an unfair deal, and we're not letting any American dairy products into this country. Yeah, we are, but we have standards. The quality, the inspection standards, the quality of the product itself is different in Canada than it is in the United States. It's the same thing with meat, for instance, and so many other elements to this. Banking is another one. I know that they'd like us to renegotiate and actually to lower the very strict standards that we have with the Canadian banking system. Can't do that. It just can't be on the table. And Trump, again, with misinformation saying, well, we won't allow American banks in here. Yeah, we do. We do, but we tell them, and part of the negotiation was, you can do business in Canada, but you have to meet these standards. Let's not forget that back in 2008, it was the American banking system that was, in large part, a cause of the massive recession that we underwent here. And that didn't happen in Canada because we have much more stringent banking rules and regulations that they are allowed and must adhere to. And we don't want to lower those standards, and we can't, and we shouldn't. So this is where the negotiation comes in. Military spending, sure, that's going to be a major element of this too, as it should be. We've been very, very laggard in Canada's commitment to NATO and how much we're actually spending on northern defense and certainly on European defense as well. Carney's talked about the fact that, we need to step up. And there's actually, I think, a consensus in this country right now that, yeah, that's got to happen. What's it going to look like? How's it going to be rolled out? And how quickly is it going to be rolled out? Well, that's, again, part of the negotiation that's going to go on here. So there's a lot going to be on the table, but I think in the context of a negotiation, an awful lot of what we've just talked about here is in the long term. The supply management deal with dairy and a number of other things. I know that there's a concern here about digital services being allowed into this country as well. The number of providers and services would love to have access to Canadian markets, and they've been banging on the door for a few years. And those are negotiable. And I know that we want to talk about those, and we want to try to find some consensus on this. But the immediate concern, as far as the Canadian government is concerned, is the tariff situation. We can't let this drag on because it's going to have a negative impact. I mean, even as late as last week, General Motors is talking about shutting down different shifts, and we know that it means layoffs altogether, whether it's, hey, take a week off or, hey, you don't have a job anymore. You can't let that fester in the Canadian economy. So Carney's got to come out of this with some kind of a guarantee, some kind of a win to say, okay, pause these until we get these negotiations, something like that. It's going to be difficult, but he's a seasoned veteran of negotiators. I know that even the Prime Minister himself tried to characterize Donald Trump as a great negotiator. I think there are people that would take exception to that, and I don't want to get into that argument right now. But Carney also has a track record, a very successful track record in his business dealings, and not just with Brookfield, but most certainly with the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England in dealing and finding people's pros and cons and weaknesses. So this is not as if we're going into this with, blinded and this idea that we're not used to this sort of negotiations. He is, and as a matter of fact, an awful lot of the people on his team are going to be too. So we need to watch this closely, and we need to be able to cut through an awful lot of the BS and the rhetoric that's going to be coming out of the White House itself. And I think one of the things that we'd like to see happen here as a result of this meeting next Tuesday is a commitment to continue these discussions, not with Trump and the Prime Minister, because as I say, I don't know how productive that could be, but with the teams that are in place. And it's around that negotiating table that we have to try to find some solutions. But just to give this some context here, when we renegotiated the free trade deal some years ago, and Chrystia Freeland, as we mentioned, was the lead for the Canadian team on that, it took months for that to happen and for them to come and hammer out an agreement. I'm not suggesting that we can just snap our fingers and find solutions to this, but we've got to find something faster than that, at least some short-term solutions, or pause in some of the rhetoric and the tariff thing that's going back and forth in this. That's something that's essential, I think, to the Canadian economy. And don't kid yourself, to the American economy too. Trump's starting to get a lot of feedback now from American businesses and farmers that are really being negatively impacted by his own tariff policies. So he's trying to find some way, maybe an exit ramp to curtail some of this stuff. So that could be a factor in our favor as we go through these discussions. So we'll be watching for it very closely, of course, to see just what's going to be happening and how it's going to impact we in this country and our long-term economic and short-term economic goals, too. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Good to have you with us on this edition. So much going on here, and we'll cover all of this for you. You can catch us on Substack, Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube, and on Blue Sky, and so many other different platforms, too. Keep the feedback coming. Always appreciate your thoughts and comments on the podcast as we bring them forward here. And we'll be going on with what's happening in Washington, certainly, and, of course, with our Canadian government, because we're going to get back to work, we're told. The Prime Minister says that just after the Victoria Day weekend here, Parliament will be back. I don't know if they're going to be meeting all summer long or whatever. Heaven knows there's a lot on the agenda that they need to deal with, and we'll certainly find that out and talk to you about that on future podcasts. Until we meet again, I'm Bill Kelly. In the meantime, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.